The bright overhead surgical lamp buzzed with a low, agonizing frequency, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the open chest cavity of a man who was moments away from flatlining. Dr. Elena Vance stared into the crimson expanse with cold, practiced precision. Her gloved fingers moved with the mechanical detachment that came from a decade of burying her emotions beneath layers of sterile green drapes. In the operating room of St. Jude Medical Center, Elena was known as an iron pillar. No matter how shattered a human body arrived on her table, her hands never shook. The heart monitor beside her emitted a frantic, rhythmic beep that was beginning to sync with the erratic pounding of her own pulse, a rare breach of the absolute calm she prided herself on maintaining. "Suction," she commanded, her voice a flat, controlled whisper that cut through the tense silence. Sarah, her senior surgical nurse, quickly cleared the field, but her eyes, over her surgical mask, revealed a deep, unspoken anxiety. Elena had felt it the moment her forceps grazed against something dense deep within the scarred myocardial tissue. The preoperative scans had shown nothing more than routine ischemic damage, a standard severe blockage requiring a bypass. Yet here, embedded in the left ventricle, was an unyielding object. With agonizing slowness, Elena extracted the foreign fragment from the bloody tissue and held it up toward the light. The metallic clink as she placed it on the stainless steel tray seemed to echo loudly through the suddenly suffocating room. It was a jagged, coin-sized piece of silver, dark with old blood and oxidized over time, but worn smooth on one side where a set of initials had been carved into the metal. When the overhead beam caught its surface, Elena's vision narrowed. Etched cleanly into the tarnished silver were two unmistakable hand-engraved letters, CV. Clara had perished 5 years ago in a horrific single-car crash on a desolate stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. The car had struck a concrete guardrail, flipped down a 100-foot embankment, and exploded into a sea of flames. The fire had burned so fiercely for hours before firefighters could reach the remote ravine that the county coroner told Elena there were almost no recognizable remains. Identification had been made through dental records and the charred frame of Clara's wedding band found in the ash. Elena had spent half a decade buried in grief, tortured by the memory of their final argument on the night of the crash, a bitter fight about Elena's long hours at the hospital and Clara's growing secretiveness. Now, holding a jagged fragment of Clara's personalized silver locket pulled directly from the heart of a dying stranger, the floor beneath Elena's feet seemed to dissolve into a terrifying void. "Doctor, his blood pressure is dropping into the 70s. We're losing him," the anesthesiologist barked, his voice shattering her shock. Elena forced her mind back into the room. She slammed her hands back into the incision and began manual cardiac massage, her mind racing through an impossible labyrinth. How could a piece of Clara's custom necklace be inside a living man's chest? For the next 4 hours, Elena operated on pure muscle memory, fighting to stabilize the stranger, while the ghost of her dead wife hovered over every movement of her scalpel. When the digital clock on the wall finally clicked past midnight and the patient was successfully stabilized and transferred to the intensive care unit, Elena walked straight into the third-floor doctor's locker room, locked the door behind her, and gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink until her knuckles turned white. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, taking in the dark circles beneath her exhausted green eyes and the faint tremor in her right hand. That tremor had first appeared 5 years ago, the morning the police knocked on her door to break the news. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the small silver fragment she had discreetly sanitized and wrapped in gauze before leaving the operating room. She unwrapped it under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was no mistaking it. Elena had ordered this exact locket from a local jeweler for Clara's 35th birthday, engraving CV on the front and their wedding date on the back. Clara had worn it every single day. The jagged tear through the silver showed it had been sheared apart by violent impact. Elena needed answers, and she needed them immediately. She walked down to the ICU nursing station, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night corridors. She pulled up the electronic medical chart for the man she had just saved, patient 408. According to the emergency room intake sheet, he had been brought in as an unidentified male, found collapsed in a local diner with severe chest pain and advanced facial scarring from old burn injuries. But as Elena clicked into the updated admissions log, her blood ran cold. The emergency contact field had been filled out less than an hour ago, while she was still in surgery. Listed as the primary contact was Mark Vance, her estranged brother-in-law. Mark was Clara's older brother, a man Elena hadn't spoken to since the memorial service 5 years ago. He lived 2 hours north in the coastal town near where Clara's car had gone over the cliff. Why was Mark listed as the contact for an unidentified stranger with Clara's locket in his heart? Elena pulled out her cell phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Mark's number. She hadn't called him in years, but the number was burned into her memory. The line rang 3 times before a heavy, tired voice answered. "Hello? Mark, it's Elena," she said, her voice tight, barely above a whisper. There was a sudden, heavy pause on the line, the sound of movement, and then Mark's tone guarded itself. "Elena, it's past midnight. What's wrong?" "Where are you right now, Mark?" she demanded, leaning against the cold wall of the hallway. "I'm at home, in bed. What is this about?" "I just finished performing emergency open-heart surgery on a man who listed you as his emergency contact," Elena said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. "And inside his heart, Mark, inside his left ventricle, I found a fragment of Clara's silver locket, the one I bought her. You need to tell me what is going on before I call the police." The silence from Mark's end was long and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its groggy, tired edge. It was cold, deliberate, and entirely lacking in surprise. "You weren't supposed to be the surgeon on call tonight, Elena. What are you talking about?" Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. "If you want to know the truth about Clara, don't talk to anyone at the hospital," Mark whispered softly. "And don't look at the patient's chart again. Go to the basement archive room, drawer 1114, under the 2019 discharge files. Look for the audit report. See what Clara was trying to stop before you judge anyone." Before Elena could speak, the line went dead. Elena stood in the dim hallway, the dead dial tone buzzing in her ear like a warning. Instead of heading home, she took the service elevator down to the basement of St. Jude Medical Center. The archives were dark, vast, and silent, smelling of aged paper and floor wax. She navigated the narrow rows of gray filing cabinets until she found drawer 114. She pulled it open, the heavy metal rollers grinding loudly in the quiet space. Scrolling through the yellowed folders labeled from 5 years prior, she found a thick file hidden behind the standard medical records. It was marked Confidential Internal Audit, Ninan 2019. Elena opened the folder under the solitary hanging light bulb. As she turned the pages, the foundation of her memory began to fracture. The file contained financial records, withdrawal slips, and signed affidavits. 5 years ago, just weeks before her fatal crash, Clara hadn't just been a devoted wife working in medical research. She had discovered that someone was systematically embezzling millions of dollars from St. Jude's Research Foundation, a charity where Elena served as an unsalaried board member. The stolen funds were being laundered through fake medical supply companies. Attached to the audit were internal hospital memos pointing to the executive director's office. David Vance. David was Elena's chief hospital administrator, her mentor, and Clara's second cousin. He was the man who had hired Elena, the man who had sat by her side at the funeral, and the man who managed the hospital's executive board. Elena stared at the financial signatures. Clara had uncovered David's massive fraud just days before her crash. Flipping further into the audit file, Elena found a copy of a private investigator's note tucked into the back. Target alerted. Drive to coast compromised. Elena's hands began to shake violently. The crash hadn't been an accident caused by rainy roads or emotional driving after their argument. David had known Clara was coming to expose him. He had tampered with her vehicle. Elena gripped the edge of the filing cabinet, tears of shock burning her eyes. But as she stared down at the file, another realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. If David had tampered with Clara's car to kill her, how did a piece of Clara's locket end up inside patient 408 tonight? Elena turned back to the discharge records in the same drawer, her mind working frantically. She searched for any record of patient 408 under his real name, but there was nothing. Then she remembered the intake sheet from the ICU. Facial reconstructive surgery, old fire injuries. She pulled out the high-resolution intake photographs taken of patient 408 when he arrived in the emergency room earlier that evening. The face in the photograph was deeply scarred around the jaw and cheeks, the hair cropped short, the frame thin and worn by years of trauma. But as Elena stared into the high-resolution close-up of the patient's eyes, the pale green iris, the tiny amber speck near the left pupil, her blood ran cold. She knew those eyes. She had looked into those eyes every morning for 10 years. Elena fell back against the metal cabinets, her breath catching in her throat in a ragged sob. Patient 408 wasn't a stranger. Patient 408 wasn't a man who had somehow acquired Clara's locket. Patient 408 was Clara. The reality shattered over Elena like ice water. Clara hadn't died in that ravine 5 years ago. The fire had engulfed the car, but Clara had been thrown through the windshield or pulled from the wreckage before the vehicle was totally destroyed. The severe burns had altered her face beyond recognition. The coroner had misidentified the charred remains found near the car due to David's influence over the local medical examiner's report, or because the fire had rendered standard identification impossible. Mark had hidden Clara away, taking her to specialized burn clinics under assumed names to save her life. During the violent impact of the crash, her silver locket had shattered, and a single jagged fragment had been driven deep into her chest cavity, embedding near her heart. For 5 years, Clara had survived in the shadows, her face destroyed, her voice raspy from smoke inhalation, her identity hidden to stay alive, while David controlled the hospital, the board, and the local authorities. She and Mark couldn't go to the police without solid proof, because David had spent 5 years framing Clara for the missing funds, planting fake evidence that made it look as though Clara had stolen the money and fled. If Clara surfaced without undeniable evidence, David would either have her silenced or ensure she went to prison forever. And tonight, when Clara's failing heart began to give out from the pressure of the embedded silver fragment, she had nowhere left to turn. Mark knew that only one surgeon possessed the extraordinary skill required to extract metal from scarred heart tissue without causing a fatal hemorrhage: Elena. Clara had risked everything, stepping back into St. Jude Medical Center under a fake identity, placing her life entirely into the hands of the woman she loved, knowing that the locket inside her heart would tell Elena the truth when words could not. A wave of overwhelming emotion crashed over Elena. 5 years of agonizing grief, guilt over their final fight, furious anger at the horrific deception, and a profound, bone-deep relief colliding all at once. Clara was alive. The woman she had mourned every single night was lying 3 floors above her, breathing because of Elena's own hands. "You always were too smart for your own good, Elena," a smooth, cold voice said from the darkness of the archive aisle. Elena snapped her head up. Standing at the end of the row of cabinets, bathed in the dim fluorescent light from the hallway, was David. He was dressed in his tailored suit, holding a sleek tablet, his expression completely devoid of his usual warm, professional demeanor. Elena stood up slowly, her body trembling with rage, clutching the audit file to her chest. "You tampered with her car," Elena said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal quiet. "You tried to murder my wife 5 years ago because she caught you stealing from this hospital. And then you stood at her memorial service and held my hand." David took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I didn't want to kill Clara, Elena. She was family. But she was stubborn, just like you. She wouldn't listen to reason. She was going to destroy everything I built here over 20 years. When her car went off that cliff, I thought it was over. I paid off the county coroner to sign the death certificate without pressing for detailed DNA testing. It was easy enough, given the state of the wreckage." "And when she survived?" Elena asked, her eyes narrowing as she backed away inch by inch toward the wall control panel. "I didn't know she survived," David admitted, his tone infuriatingly calm. "Not until an hour ago. Mark thought he was being clever, using a forged charity grant code to cover her emergency intake costs tonight. But I built the hospital's billing system. Any override using my family's old foundation codes triggers an immediate alert on my phone. I checked the intake photos. The moment I saw those green eyes, I knew who was lying on your operating table." David stopped 10 feet away, reaching into his suit jacket. Clara brought a secure hard drive with her tonight. Mark had been collecting the final electronic bank ledgers to prove my guilt. It was in her personal belongings in the ICU locker. I've already retrieved it and wiped the drive. He pulled out a small syringe, pre-filled with a clear, lethal concentration of potassium chloride, a substance that causes immediate cardiac arrest without leaving an obvious trace in a patient already suffering from severe heart trauma. "It ends tonight, Elena. Patient 408 suffers a fatal post-operative cardiac arrest in the ICU. You will be crushed by the loss, of course, but everyone will accept it as a tragic medical outcome. And if you say a word about this audit, I will ensure the board ruined your reputation with the fake embezzlement paper trail I laid 5 years ago." David stepped toward her, raising the syringe. He was larger than her, stronger, and completely convinced of his own control. "You spent 5 years managing this hospital, David," Elena said, her voice cold and steady, her right hand reaching behind her back toward the wall. "But you forgot one thing. I know every inch of this building." Before David could react, Elena slammed her hand down onto the large red emergency medical bypass panel on the wall behind her. Instantly, intense strobe lights flashed overhead, and high-decibel fire alarms began to blare throughout the entire basement and ICU wing. The heavy magnetic fire doors at both ends of the archive aisle slammed shut with a thunderous bang, locking automatically to seal the sector. At the same time, the hospital's central security system, programmed to respond to emergency containment triggers, activated the automated overhead sprinkler system in the document vaults to protect fire records. A torrential downpour of cold water burst from the ceiling nozzles, blinding David and soaking him instantly. He stumbled back, coughing and wiping his eyes, dropping the slippery glass syringe onto the concrete floor where it shattered into pieces. Elena didn't waste a second. While David was disoriented by the blaring sirens and blinding water, she grabbed a heavy metal archive box from the shelf beside her and shoved it with all her strength into his chest. David lost his balance on the wet, slippery floor and went down hard, his head striking the metal framing of the lower shelf. He lay dazed, groaning, blinded by the deluge, and trapped behind the sealed magnetic doors. Elena snatched the wet audit file, slipped through the manual emergency release handle on the side exit door, and sprinted into the stairwell. Her heart pounded as she took the stairs 3 at a time, racing toward the 4th floor. The alarms were ringing across the hospital, staff members rushing through the halls in confusion. Elena ignored them all. She pushed through the double doors of the intensive care unit and walked straight toward room 408. Through the glass window, she could see the quiet rise and fall of the patient's chest, hooked up to the heart monitor that was now rhythmically, steadily beeping at a healthy 60 beats per minute. The room was quiet, isolated from the alarm system by soundproof medical glass. Elena opened the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She walked over to the side of the bed. She looked down at the face of patient 408. Up close, beneath the surgical scars around her jaw and the years of survival, she saw the subtle line of Clara's cheekbones, the gentle shape of her brow, the familiar indelible grace that no fire or surgeon's knife could ever erase. Slowly, Elena reached out her trembling hand and gently brushed a lock of short hair away from the forehead of the woman she thought she had lost forever. The eyelids of the patient fluttered open, deep green eyes, clear and conscious, focused on Elena. A faint, weak breath escaped the patient's lips, and a small, unmistakable smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Elena." The voice was raspy, deep, and damaged by old smoke, but the cadence, the tender, breathless emphasis on her name, belonged entirely to Clara. Elena felt a lump form in her throat, 5 years of unexpressed pain swelling inside her chest. "You let me mourn you," Elena whispered, her voice cracking with a painful mixture of love, heartbreak, and anger. "You let me live in that empty house for 5 years, Clara. I thought our last words to each other were that terrible fight." Clara's eyes filled with tears, running down her scarred cheeks into her hair. She reached up with a weak, trembling hand, her fingers pressing lightly against Elena's palm. "Every single day." "It broke my heart, Elle," Clara rasped softly, her voice shaking with genuine agony. "Mark and I tried to protect you. David threatened to kill you if I ever came near you again. He told me he had planted evidence to make you look like my accomplice if the stolen money was found. I couldn't risk your life, Elena. I couldn't let him destroy you too." Clara squeezed Elena's hand with what little strength she had left. "The fight we had, it wasn't about you working late. I was trying to push you away that night because I knew David was watching us. I was trying to keep you safe. My last thought before the car hit the guardrail was wishing I had told you how much I loved you." The heavy weight that had rested on Elena's chest for 5 agonizing years finally shattered. The guilt, the resentment, the phantom pain of that unfinished argument vanished into the quiet air of the room. Tears finally overflowed Elena's eyes, hot and free, running down her cheeks as she leaned down and gently pressed her forehead against Clara's, taking her hand in both of hers and holding it against her heart. "I'm here, Clara," Elena sobbed quietly, her voice steady and fierce. "I've got you. You're safe now." Outside, in the hallway, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor as police officers and hospital security, alerted by the emergency system and the evidence Elena had flagged, closed in on the basement archives where David was trapped. His reign of fear and corruption was over. The truth was out, the police had the audit files, and the long, dark night was finally drawing to a close. Elena stood by the bed, her hand locked firmly with Clara's, her right hand completely still, the tremor gone at last. True betrayal often comes from those who wear the mask of authority and protection, hiding behind institutional power and calculated lies. But the human heart possesses a quiet, unbreakable resilience. It can carry the weight of shattered memories, endure years of silent grief, and still recognize the truth the moment love calls it back into the light.